Hello everyone. So I'm back with another Leetcode solutions tutorial, and today we are going to solve another array problem. And the problem for the day is going to be to replace elements with greatest element on right side. So just to give you a brief overview of how the problem goes by, we have an input array of ARR or with the name ARR, and we have to replace every element in that array with the greatest element among the elements to its right and replace the last element with -1. First time when I read this, I had no clue what was expected. But after going through the example, it became a lot more clear and it is quite an easy problem. So let's say you have an input array with elements 17, 18, 5, 4, 6, 1, and you are supposed to use some kind of algorithm to solve this problem. Now, the way this problem goes by is we pick up each element. For example, let's say we pick up 17 and then we search for all the elements after that element index. That is, we search on a sub array of 18 to element 1 and we try to find the greatest element. Now if you try to find the greatest element from 18, 5, 4, 6, 1, obviously it is 18, right? So then we replace the first element with 18. That is, we are replacing the greatest element on the right hand side of our array or the sub array with the element which is present currently at that index. Once I'm done with that, my element at index 0 will be 18. After that, we move on to the second index. And here we again start searching for elements after this element index. That is, once my first element is added to 18, I will now search for the greatest element which is present after 18. Now in this case, our subarray becomes 5, 4, 6, and 1. And obviously the greatest element is 6 here. So we replace 18 with 6 and we move ahead. Similarly, we get to the element 5. And here we can see that the element 4, 6, 1 are remaining. And from that, 6 is the highest. So we replace 4 with 6 as well. That is why we have element 6 been replaced 3 times. Now, once we are done with that and we come to the last index, we need to replace the last element with -1. That is, once the last element here is, let's say 6, because uh, the element replacement strategy was complete, and we went to the finding the last element here, right, which is, let's say for 6, we searched for the last element, which is 1, and we placed 1 in place of 6. Now, at the last index, we replace the element as -1. So the resultant array becomes 18, 6, 6, 6, 1, and -1. That is 18, 666, 1, and -1. So our job is first to replace each element at each index with the greatest element from the rest of the subarray. And at the end, replace the last element of the array with -1. That is, we are left shifting the elements in some way, but greatest element basically. And once the elements, greatest elements are shifted towards the left, the last element is replaced by -1. So that is how the problem is designed, or the problem is supposed to be solved. Now we have some constraints here for array length and element index. So array length can be up to 10 raised to 4, and each element of the index could be of value from 1 to 10 raised to 5, and that's good enough. So coming back to our language of choice, we select JavaScript from the languages and we get a function like this. I usually I replace var with const usually, and then I start my code. So coming to this example, let's just take this example and try to come up with a pseudocode. So from this, we know that we have to iterate the array at least once. Why? Because we need to pick an element at a particular index and then go for searching the max element towards the subarray, right? So the first thing which comes to my mind is just to write a simple for loop with let I is equal to starting from 0, I is less than the ARR is my input array, right? So ARR dot length and increment the I index. Then let's just print out the array elements before we move it. So I'm just going to print each element of my array. And let's give it a log as element at index. And we print I as well as the element at that index. And let's just run the code and see the output. So we have our array working fine for each of the elements. Now, let's take the first case where the index is 0 and we are trying to replace the element 17. Now, when we are trying to replace the element 17 with the greatest element, obviously I have to iterate over the rest of the elements and find the maximum element from the rest of the elements, right? So what we can do is we can write another function here, which will return the greatest element from the rest of the array, that is from the subarray. So in this case, we can pass the current index or the starting index from which we need to search. So for example, when we are at index 0, we need to search from the index 1, right? So this can take an input parameter, let's say start index, and after that we can then try to search on the rest of the elements. So in this case, we can now search for the greatest element from the subarray basically by calling this function. Let's give it a name from subarray so that we are completely clear. And we use the greatest element function here. So that this is how we define functions in JavaScript. And we pass the start index. Now, in this case, what will be the start index? It will be I plus 1 because we need to search from the next index, right? So let's pass the value I plus 1. Now, how do we find the greatest element? First, we have to initialize the element which is as the first as the greatest element, and then we search for the rest of the elements. If there is any element greater than the rest of the elements, we assign that as the greatest element. For example, when we are iterating for the first time, we'll first assign a temporary greatest element as let's say 18, and then we will iterate over the rest of the elements. And if we find any greatest element other than 18 in the entire iteration, we will replace 18 with that greatest element. And towards the end of our loop or the iteration, we will have the greatest element from the subarray. So let's assign the greatest or temporary greatest element or largest element, we can say, as the element at the start index, right? Then we again write a loop. This time we start from, okay, let's initialize it at j. Let's start from the start index plus 1 value because we already have used the element at the first index, right? So we can search for the rest of the elements for the greatest one. I'm just guessing that this is how the code should work. So let j is equal to start index plus 1. Let j is less than the array length, obviously, and j plus plus. We might have to do some modifications in this loop, but for now this should work. And then what we will do is we'll compare our temporary greatest element. If the temporary greatest element is less than the element which is present at ARR of j, that is the next index. For example, we are comparing 5 and 18, and if 18 is greater than 5, hypothetically, we will replace 5 with 18, something like that. So then our time greatest element will be having the value which is present at ARR of j. And once we have our greatest element like this, let's just log out the greatest element first. And check whether in the first pass we are getting the value as 18. For the rest of the values, they might be incorrect, but for the first, it should return as 18. And let's run the code. And as we can see, the greatest element here is returned as 18. So at least for the first pass, this is working. So what we can do is we can return the greatest element here. For the time greatest element. Now coming back to the main loop. Once we have the greatest element from the subarray, the next task is to replace that element at the index, right? So we will write ARR of I, which is the current index. For example, in the first index, we have to replace the greatest element returned from the function back into index 0. So error of I is equal to greatest element from subarray, and this should work for the rest of the loop. Now let's just check the entire array once the entire iteration is complete. So we'll write array after replacements as the entire array, and let's just see what the output is after the entire replacement operations, and we run the code again. Now this is what we get, which is 18661, and last element obviously will be undefined because we have to replace it by -1, but I don't think it should have got replaced in the first place, right? So what we can do is we should not run this replacement strategy till the length of the array, but till -1, because the last element obviously should not be replaced by anything. What will happen if I run it till the last element is, when it comes to the last element, the I plus 1 value will be not a valid index, because when I is pointing to, let's say, the last index, I plus 1 would be something which is out of the array, right? That is not something which we want. So let's keep this array length to till the second last element, and let's run the code again and check what is the output. Now we have replaced all the elements perfectly. Now the one task which is needed is to replace the last element with -1. So once the entire replacement is done, we will write ARR of the last element accesses by ARR dot length -1, because ARR dot length returns the entire length. For example, if this is containing 6 elements, it will return 6, but the index of the last element is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because indexes start from 0. It is 1 less than the length of the array, and we replace this as -1, and let's just return our array. So this is what our output will return, or our program will return, and let's run our code. Now as we can see, the output here and the output expected output is correct. So the first test case is passed. Now let's try to run our code on all the test cases and see if it is working properly. If there is any issue, we will know as well. But our submission is accepted, so this is a valid submission. The last thing which we can do is we can log out or remove the comment out the console.log statements, and that is simply how we have solved the replace elements with greatest problem. And there might be a better solutions to this. Currently this is what I came up with. If you have any better solutions, feel free to tell them in the chat or the comments section, and I will probably share that in the comments or with others as well. And that's it from my end. I hope you understood this problem, and if you found this video useful, please like the video, share it with someone who might be giving interviews or preparing for data structure interviews, and subscribe to my channel if you want to learn more such tutorials as well. That's it from my end. Goodbye and have a nice day, everyone.